Hello everyone, and welcome back to our channel. A lot has been happening in the world lately, and today, we are diving deep into a critical situation that has unfolded in Eastern Europe. The Ukrainian conflict has cast a long shadow, and Russia is now facing perhaps its most profound social and political turmoil since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Let's examine the developments and repercussions of this situation. The staggering losses on the front lines are not just statistics. They have become a severe societal injury. Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin's leadership have encountered unprecedented opposition from inside Russia, specifically from the mothers, wives, and sisters of the soldiers. What kind of socio-political crisis has this created for Putin's regime in the country? In the initial months of the conflict, these women were comforted with the idea that their men were fighting heroically in Ukraine. However, as time moved on and they failed to receive reliable information from their loved ones, their faith in the government's narrative started to collapse. They started protesting against the contradictory statements from the military command and took to the streets. Despite the Kremlin's censorship efforts, the cries of "Give us back our husbands" and "We are tired of being good girls" became increasingly louder and more frequent. For the Kremlin, this type of social revolt is perhaps the most dangerous development. It's important to recall that in Russian history, the opposition of soldiers' mothers and wives to state policies has often had substantial consequences. The Russian invasion of Afghanistan saw mothers mobilize upon discovering that their sons had been killed or injured, and that the state was attempting to hide these losses. Similarly, during the Chechen Wars, mothers and wives again raised their voices in protest, sometimes even engaging in negotiations with the Kremlin. And now, in the Ukrainian conflict, we have seen hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers sent to the front, with tens of thousands either killed or wounded. The Kremlin's rhetoric of a patriotic duty has long lost credibility with mothers and wives, as the casualty rates climb higher and higher. Across the Russian landscape, mothers' committees and coordination groups of soldiers' wives are emerging and growing stronger. It's crucial to note that even in the post-Soviet era, the so-called Mothers of Russian Soldiers movement was considered by the Kremlin as one of the most dangerous forms of civil opposition. Today, this movement is becoming a significant problem for Putin, causing turmoil even within his supposed base of support. The parents of these soldiers have tried all possible channels for information, yet their pleas have gone unanswered. Russian mothers even wrote letters to Vladimir Putin in 2022, demanding answers for their missing sons, stating that their sons did not receive any military training. In the letter, they said that they had simply dug the soil to create trenches, pulled grass, walked for a while in a ceremony area, and prepared for the oath. With this letter, these Russian mothers showed Vladimir Putin what the power of the tears of rebellion meant. Recent photographs published in the international press show women carrying banners bearing the phrases, "Where is my son?" and "Enough with the war," creating an unsettling image for the Putin administration. Riots and silent protests are becoming more frequent. These protests sometimes take various forms. For example, a group of mothers in the Novosa region demonstrated at the governor's office, holding hands and chanting. In Russia, mothers have a say. "Where are our sons?" Amateur videos of this demonstration spread rapidly on social media. However, the police quickly intervened, confiscating the phones of those recording and detaining some of the protesters. In St. Petersburg, soldiers' wives organized an event called Silent March, walking around the city square carrying pictures of their sons and husbands. They did not shout slogans, but the expressions on their faces communicated everything. The police attempted to break up this march as well. The recurring question of why is Putin hiding from real mothers has become widespread in Russian society. The scandal of the fake mothers gathering on television only fueled this anger, and real Russian mothers demanded the end of mobilization and an end to the war in Ukraine. They stated that they would continue to plead until their sons were reunited with their families. Yet Kremlin leader Vladimir Putin ignored all of this and continued the conflict aggressively. This war continues to this day with all its intensity, yet it has not diminished the hopes of these Russian mothers. The Russian state is working tirelessly to censor and suppress these reactions, employing press bans, a climate of fear and threats. The Kremlin is again resorting to threats and deception to extinguish this rebellion. Regional commanders have summoned women and threatened them, accusing them of trying to reveal state secrets and stating that they will be tried for treason. Sometimes they try to distract them with lies, claiming that their son is already specially trained and on duty, advising them not to worry. However, when mothers respond by saying my son has been silent for 5 months and his cell phone is almost turned off, what kind of training are you talking about? Tensions are mounting. Many reports indicate that buses traveling from the regions to Moscow are being stopped by police and turned back under the pretext that these women are planning illegal demonstrations. These tactics are used to prevent women from organizing mass protests in the capital. Nevertheless, some persistent groups attempt to reach Moscow through clandestine routes, unfurling a banner around the Kremlin. The banner reads, "We are tired of being good girls. We want to know where our husbands and sons are." Within 3 minutes, the police tore down all the banners and detained the women. Even this incident was not reported in the Russian media, but went viral on social media. After the first chapter include this: "Hey everyone, if you're finding this information important, please consider subscribing to our channel and hitting that like button. It really helps us out and allows us to bring you more content like this. Also, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love hearing from our community. And please, make sure you watch until the end, because the conclusions are going to be crucial." One aspect of the women's protest is the "Stop the Massacre" rhetoric. It's not just "I want my son back," but also "Stop this war. Innocent people are dying." As some wives and mothers learn more about what's happening in Ukraine, they realize that it's far away from them, and it is the Ukrainians who are being victimized. They've come to the conclusion that this conflict is pointless. Voicing this sentiment publicly, of course, risks accusations of treason in Russia. Yet, in street interviews, some anonymous women say we have no political views. We simply want peace. We do not want our children to die, and we don't want Ukrainians to die. This stance is completely at odds with the official propaganda, which is constantly promoting a narrative that we are fighting a holy war, like in the Second World War, and that we are destroying the Nazis. Women who have lost husbands and sons are now saying, "We don't believe in this fairy tale." The Kremlin has engaged in numerous propaganda campaigns to manage these reactions. For example, Putin has occasionally broadcast footage of meetings with soldiers' mothers to give the impression that he was listening to their concerns. But it became clear that many of the women in these meetings were FSB or Defense Ministry employees and had nothing to do with real soldiers' mothers. The more these staged events were exposed, the greater the anger grew. The real mothers reacted, asking why the Kremlin was listening to fake mothers instead of to them. They wanted to know where their sons were and why they had disappeared. A group of Russian women, under the umbrella of an organization known as the Women's Union, repeatedly demonstrated in central Moscow. The police intervened harshly to disperse these women and made many arrests. However, even this harshness did not stop the protests. The protesting women stated, "We are tired of being good girls, we want our husbands back, and don't let our children grow up without fathers." This may very well be one of the few instances of civil disobedience in Russia in recent history. Furthermore, in a society raised on the Soviet legacy, the rebellion of soldiers' mothers against the state holds substantial symbolic significance. People who had previously been silenced by the myth of sacrifice for the homeland now seem to be convinced that this war is not a defense of the homeland, but a senseless destruction. But what actually triggered the recent protests was that the Kremlin's primary concern was the complete opposite of what the Russian mothers and soldiers' wives wanted. Putin made a critical decision to repeat the error he made in 2022 and announced that he would send 300,000 of his troops to the center of the conflict. The announcement was made on the second anniversary of the first mobilization in September of 2024. This in itself revealed Putin's true attitude. But history repeats itself, and the fortitude and conviction of women is something that should not be underestimated by any authority in any nation. It's likely that these will be inexperienced soldiers who are currently undergoing short-term training within Russia. Ivan Balf, the head of the training department of the Russian Armed Forces, did not specify when these 300,000 reservists were trained. There are many doubts about this information. However, the Russian military leadership claims that they were trained in 2024. Former Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu had established 9 reserve battalions to train and prepare contract soldiers to compensate for Russia's losses in Ukraine by the end of 2023. According to Shoigu, 335,000 people signed up to fight voluntarily in 2023. The Russian Defense Ministry has already confirmed that more than 300,000 soldiers have recently signed voluntary contracts to participate in the war in Ukraine. The Kremlin and state media describe this as a special military operation. While it remains unclear whether they have been trained or whether they will voluntarily join the war fronts, the Kremlin's move highlights a major shift in Russia's military approach. The move of relying heavily on volunteer soldiers instead of large-scale conscription is a clear indication that the Kremlin's military structure is in decay. Ivan Balv, head of the Combat Training Directorate of the Russian Armed Forces, said the creation of reserve regiments designed specifically for this purpose had been successful. But it seems unlikely that a professional army can be replaced by 300,000 reluctant but volunteer battalions. This is because these regiments are usually comprised of new recruits who are willing to serve for a certain period of time under contract, thus offering an alternative to compulsory service. In other words, volunteer military elements can only increase the casualty figures of the Russian army, as they will not receive adequate training in warfare. Mobilization is essentially a tool for gathering manpower. However, if the morale of this force is low, or if it is constantly questioned by mothers and wives, military success becomes exceptionally difficult. Airplanes, artillery, tanks, these are all crucial. But war is ultimately fought by people. Such a substantial reaction from the families of these people also damages the motivation of the Russian army. Despite the possibility of higher casualty rates, this volunteer force is becoming a surprisingly integral part of Russia's military strategy. It allows the Russian government to mobilize additional forces for the ongoing conflict without resorting to mass conscription, which can be seen as a politically sensitive move. Voluntary service contracts usually come with stipulations on salary, benefits, and the duration of the soldier's commitment. The government's reliance on these contracts reflects a broader trend within the Russian military. This trend aims to bolster its ranks with individuals who are willing to fight for compensation instead of being forced to do compulsory service. This is seen as another factor that could potentially set Russia up for a military disaster rather than success. There are, of course, doubts as to whether these 300,000 soldiers who will be sent to the conflict in Ukraine will really be sent to the front of their own free will. Some of the Russian soldiers on the front lines are already fighting without an answer to the crucial question: why are we here? The same question is being asked by women who cannot be reunited with their husbands and sons. Furthermore, it seems that the Russian economy will not be able to cover this cost for long. While the soldiers were experiencing miserable conditions at the front in terms of salaries, equipment, and logistics, Russian officials were content to say, "Everything is fine," and to support our heroes. As time passed, the number of those who fled the mobilization reached into the hundreds of thousands. The fate of those who could not or did not want to flee was the news of deaths and casualties coming from the front lines. Although official statements say that casualties are very low and that the operation is progressing successfully, there are thousands of women across Russia who are desperately asking, "Where is my son?" Many of them believe that young people who had never been in the army before, or who had been trained quickly, and who were said to have barely learned how to dig in the ground, were buried under the rubble, and that mass casualties did, in fact, occur. Russian mothers continued to search for their children, following every single trace of them. Just as the hopes of these mothers were crumbling, an unexpected move came. A project was launched, aiming to make these mothers happy. But unlike the Russian regime, this project was undertaken by Ukraine. Now we will explore this project in depth and discover how the reputation of the Kremlin regime has been completely shattered, and how Ukrainians appear to care more about the missing Russian soldiers than Putin does. The Ukrainian initiative to find missing Russian soldiers, called I Want to Find, provides information to families about Russian soldiers who have been captured or killed. The initiative is a stark contrast to Moscow's "we don't care about your soldiers" stance, And it makes women think even the Ukrainians, the so-called enemies, care more about our sons than we do. This is a devastating blow to the Kremlin's reputation, because in the eyes of the mothers, it's unthinkable that Ukraine, rather than their own state, is extending a helping hand. Some families are directly contacting Ukrainian hotlines to inquire about the fate of their children. The very existence of this communication is dangerous for Putin. The public is realizing that the declared enemy is providing more information and compassion to families, reducing him to the position of a leader who cannot deceive mothers with hush money. This severely challenges the historical legitimacy of the Russian leadership. A separate I Want to Find project, which is a part of the I Want to Live hotline launched in September of 2022 by Ukrainian military intelligence to help Russian soldiers surrender, was created to address questions from Russian families about missing soldiers. The project was launched with the aim of the voluntary surrender of Russian and Belarusian servicemen as prisoners of war. Bogdan Okeno, head of the Secretariat of the Coordination Center, announced in an interview that more than 50,000 applications were submitted by Russians looking for missing servicemen under Ukraine's I Want to Find Them project. This is truly a striking number. Bogdan Okeno says these numbers reflect only those who are not afraid to contact Ukraine, and suggests that the real number of Russian soldiers missing in action could be much higher. Okeno criticized Russia's lack of effort to find or identify the missing, noting that many of these soldiers are simply scattered in Ukrainian fields. Russian Deputy Defense Minister Anna Kova announced that her ministry had received 48,000 DNA test applications from relatives of missing soldiers, seeking information about them. Speaking at a roundtable discussion in the State Duma, Kova claimed that the DNA data of relatives was collected and stored in a database, which inadvertently provided a rare insight into the number of soldiers missing in action. Andrei Kopolov, chairman of the State Duma Defense Committee, warned against making such figures public, saying that such information was extremely sensitive. These statements clearly showed how Ukraine and Russia were acting on this issue. The Ukrainian side cared more about the Russian soldiers than the Kremlin did, and it made far more efforts to find the missing soldiers. The Ukrainians were rewarded handsomely for their perseverance. Since its launch in January, Ukraine's Kochu-90 I Want to Find project has helped find 588 missing Russian soldiers. Of those Russian soldiers, 533 were found alive amongst the captives, while 100 were released to Russia as part of a prisoner exchange. Of those who lost their lives, 55 were identified. The remains of 33 of them were handed over to Russia. Since the beginning of the year, the service has received 20,009 requests from relatives of Russian servicemen. This is another record broken by the Ukrainian service, I Want to Find. The information on the website that the project was initiated by the Ukrainian Peace Coordination Center as a demonstration of Ukraine's commitment to the principles of international humanitarian law already reveals all these facts. The Russian authorities do not communicate properly with the soldiers' relatives. No one is informing the families about what happened to the Russian army soldiers, who remained in Ukraine as occupiers and invaders. With this project, the Ukrainians have completely turned the tables and raised the hopes of Russian families once again. To summarize, there are many examples in history where military defeats and collapses in Russia have often been accelerated by internal revolts or mass protests. Now, this mother's revolt could very well be the most significant threat to Putin's rule. Some analysts predict that this is not a scenario for a full-scale revolution, but they do believe that public discontent will deepen and that Putin will most likely harden his security apparatus. Still, these reactions from the wives and mothers of the tens of thousands of soldiers who have been killed or have disappeared are by no means a spark that can simply be extinguished. It is important to remember that mothers have significant moral authority, even in traditional patriarchal structures like Russia. These women, acting out of genuine emotion beyond the lies or propaganda of the state, are pushing the regime into a corner in the strongest way possible. They are essentially asking, what political interests are at stake over the blood of our sons? This is precisely why the regime is afraid. Because even in the post-Soviet era, structures like the well-known Committee of Soldiers' Mothers were not considered illegal, but they have always met with strong reservations from the state. Against this backdrop, there are two possible paths for Russia in the coming period. Either the Kremlin will choose to suppress these women's movements with harsh methods and risk a bigger backlash, or it will take a shocking step back and consider softening the war. For now, Putin seems to be on the first path, but if the heavy losses on the ground in Ukraine continue, and if the Russian economy moves closer to collapse, the revolt of the mothers could lead to major political upheavals in Moscow. Looking at the current picture, Putin is still experimenting with new waves of mobilization, with the message "hold tight, victory is near." Adding to this is the rhetoric that 300,000 new volunteer soldiers are going to the front lines. But even the term volunteer is objected to by the wives and mothers of the soldiers, who claim that they are being forcibly recruited. What volunteerism indeed? The extent to which conscription in Russia is voluntary, and to what extent people are forced to do it due to pressure and financial hardship, is a major question mark. The war is not only shaped by the duel of tanks and cannons, but also by the tears and rebellions of mothers. In short, the cry of soldiers, mothers, and wives in Russia, "We are tired of being good girls," has become Putin's worst nightmare. Stop this war. Don't sacrifice our sons. We don't want your lies. They are speaking the truth that the Kremlin does not want to hear. At the moment, the Putin regime may be surviving on the strength of its security apparatus and propaganda machine. But every life lost on the front line is fueling the rebellion at home. It is precisely if Putin fails to heed this voice from within that Putinism's most devastating blow is likely to have grave consequences. As the casualties mount and the war drags on, the concept of Russian mothers and wives could become the biggest popular movement to shake Putin's power. Thank you for watching our channel. We appreciate you spending time with us, and, in conclusion, we will briefly recap the key points covered in this video.